Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about mixing a bass guitar in a straightforward and typical fashion for a pop rock song. Along the way, I'll take you through my signal chain, which includes an amp simulator plugin, multiple compressors, an equalizer, and also some special effects. Finally, at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about gain staging and headroom with plugins inside of a DAW, and also touch a little bit on nonlinear processing. So let's get started. Here's my Pro Tools session I've been using for the last couple videos. Hopefully you're not tired of it yet. But for those of you that have been asking, I'm going to be showing you the bass guitar today. If you haven't seen any of the other videos, I've got drum mix, percussion here, tambourine, some acoustic guitar tracks, electric guitar rhythm tracks, some lead guitar tracks, and then here are my bass guitar tracks. They're all going into this master fader right here. Then I have my talkback microphone as well. I've already got some plugins set up on the channels, and I'll be going through each one of these so you can see my signal flow when I'm mixing the bass guitar, and I'll go through and show you all the parameters that I'm using. Let me switch over right now in Pro Tools from the mix view to the edit window, show you the two tracks that I've got going on and why I've got two bass tracks. Similar to my lead guitar, I have two tracks for the sole purpose of just switching back and forth between the tracks, so I don't have to worry about playing the correct bass part for the entire time. So it starts out on this track, then it switches over to this track, and finally it returns to this track for the ending part of the song. So that's why I have it duplicated. I have this track, and then I've duplicated it, except I didn't keep the active playlist on it when I was duplicating. And so that's my basic setup for the bass guitar. Let me switch back over now. I'm going to go through. I'll just bypass all these plugins, and you can hear the bass guitar, how it's sitting in the mix without any processing. Then I'll go through it and describe what I'm doing each stage along the way. So here's the mix with the bass guitar recorded clean. Okay, so that's the general idea on the song. What I was doing there at the end, by muting it, the bass track, taking it in and out, sometimes with bass, I find myself, that's a little bit hard to hear what's really going on. And it's not until sometimes when you take it out that you can really hear what's missing. So with bass, sometimes when I'm mixing, what I'll do is I'll just mute it, bring it back in and out, and that helps me make sure I'm listening to the bass and kind of focus my ears in on the sound that I'm looking for, because sometimes it's hard with bass. So what I was playing for you, some of my just my perception about what I was hearing with the bass, it sounds pretty good in the mix without any processing. That's just a bass recorded direct. It kind of sounds a little bit round and a little bit boomy, maybe a little bit too much low end. It just doesn't sound clean. It sounds more kind of warm, and maybe too warm in the extent that I think that it just sounds muddy. So that's going to be one of the things I'm trying to address while I'm mixing. Let me play it back in solo so you can hear it. All right, so that's a DI bass. Sounds pretty typical for a bass guitar just getting recorded. What I was using actually was a Line 6 SVX 700 bass. So if you've seen any of my other videos with mixing guitar, I have the Line 6 SVX 700 electric guitar. So I have the bass version of it also. And what that bass guitar is a modeling bass, and it simulates the sound of many different kinds of bass guitars. In this case, I'm using the Music Man bass model and running that direct out of the bass guitar. I'm using the SVX cable. That's a special kind of cable that goes into my Pod HD 500, and then the Pod HD 500 goes into my 002. So I'm recording that sound dry, no effects or anything going on in the Pod HD 500, and I've got that recorded into Pro Tools as a direct bass. So the first thing I want to do is simulate the sound of an amplifier. That's typical when you're playing the bass to use an amplifier. Some people, when they're recording, they'll just mix in an amplifier with a direct bass sound. I think that's a good way to try out, and some people like that. I'm just going to use an amp simulator to simulate what it would be like if I had just recorded only the amplifier. So let me show you what I'm using. I'm using the Amplitude 3 from IK Multimedia, the Ampeg bass pack. In my previous video, where I was showing you amp simulator plugins for guitars, I showed you a bunch of different ones. I showed you 11, I showed you Amplitude 3, I showed you Guitar Rig, I showed you GTR3 from Waves, several different ones. However, for bass, I almost find that I always go back to the Ampeg plugin. I have several other ones, and all those ones I listed before come with some bass guitar plugins, but I find that I always go back to Ampeg. And I don't know what else to tell you. With guitar, I find that I like to try out different ones depending on a song. Maybe I like the Vox AC30 sound on one song by using maybe the Line 6 plugin. Maybe a different song, I like to use the Guitar Rig Vox AC30 sound. But so that's with guitar. I like to mix and match. With bass, my opinion is I always go with Ampeg. I know that there are other ones out there that are specifically for bass. Maybe there's like a Mark bass one. However, I've always been satisfied with the Ampeg one. I highly recommend it, and that's what I'm using here. So I'm using this model. I'll show you the other ones that are available. BA 500, the 15, and then these other two as well. And this is the cabinet that I'm using. There are several other ones that you can use that come as part of the Ampeg pack. On the amplifier, I've got the gain turned up a fair amount. The dry signal that was coming in was pretty quiet, so I'm kind of using the gain to step up the volume of the input signal. I'm also using the master to put it at a more reasonable level. You can see here with the fader, when I had it dry, I had to turn it up pretty loud just so you could hear it in the mix. So I'm right away using the amp simulator plugin to turn up the bass a fair amount. A lot of the shaping that I'm doing with the amplifier, I'm doing with this graphic EQ over here. Right off the bat, I'm pulling out 40 hertz. I'm doing that specifically because I don't want the low end to be overpowering. A lot of times with the bass guitar and any instrument, you got to watch out for the low frequency range, 40 hertz and below, because it's not really going to add a whole lot to your ear, but what it's going to do is cause problems for you on your, if you have like a limiter or a compressor later on in your signal chain, even on your mix bus. By having those really low frequencies, they're really hard for your ear to hear, and you might as well just take them out so it doesn't cause any problems with those other processors. So that's what I'm doing. I'm pulling out 40 hertz using this graphic EQ. 80 hertz I'm leaving maybe a little bit down, and then 150 hertz I'm boosting up a little bit. I find that around this frequency range is good for bass because that's right around the fundamental frequency of the notes that are being played. So I want that to come out a little bit. I'll come back a little bit later and talk about another reason why I kind of turn down around 80 hertz. I've got these flat around here. 600 I pull out a little bit. That makes room for some of the vocals. Same thing with 300. I pull that maybe down a little bit. The last thing is up here around 9,000 hertz. I take that out. That's all the high frequency stuff. That's basically noise. A lot of times with bass, you're not going to get a lot of actual signal from the notes that you're playing around 9,000 hertz. Sometimes you'll get finger noise and stuff like that in this frequency range. So I'm just going to go ahead and take it out right away. I'm not going to lose a lot of information in the signal that I want, but hopefully what I'm just going to do is take out the signal that I don't like. Then going back to this equalizer over here, I've just boosted a little bit of the bass, a little bit of the treble, and that's really it. So what I'll do is switch in and out so you can hear the processing going on here in this plugin. This is in, bypassed, again, here's the cabinet. I'm using these two microphones, one's of an RE20 and one's of this kind of bottle microphone. I've muted the reverb. I don't usually like to use reverb on bass. So my goal in using the amplifier simulator right off the bat was to do a little bit of the sound shaping by pulling out some frequencies, especially in the low end. Hopefully what I've also done is warmed it up in a good way. So before the sound was kind of thick and muddy, what I'm trying to do here is make it a little bit more clean, but also thicken it up in the right frequency areas. So that's what I've done by boosting around 150 hertz, but pulling out down by about 40 hertz and a little bit back off at 80 hertz. So that's all I've done right off the bat with my amp simulator plugin. Next, I've got these kind of special effects plugins. I've showed you them in other videos. These are the virtual console collection and the virtual tape machine. There's not much to them other than the fact that what they do is just add a little special sauce or secret sauce on your signal. It's not going to do anything that dramatic, but what it's going to do is hopefully just warm things up a little bit, make it sound more pleasing to your ears by doing some special kind of maybe nonlinear processing to add a little bit of extra warmth or simulate the sound of your signal, your bass guitar going through a analog console and then also on a tape machine. People primarily rave about the tape machine for being great for like the kick drum and also for the bass guitar. It's good on a lot of other instruments too. However, when people think about the sound of tape, a lot of times what they're thinking about is the good, pleasing sound of a bass guitar on tape. So I would definitely recommend, if you're trying to improve the sound of your bass guitar recordings, consider tape machine simulation. Hopefully that will help you out, improve the sound. The one I'm using here is a Slate Digital virtual tape machine, and I'll show you, I'll bypass this first and show you the VCC. I'm using SSL. Nothing too fancy, virtual tape machine. This is definitely going to help out the low end. I'll show you my settings. I've got the noise reduction down. Bass alignment, which is the main one for bass, I've just got set at unity. Bias at normal. these different settings, this will emphasize the bass. If I go low, emphasize the high end, back to normal, that's fine. Different tape speeds will emphasize the bass region more. So if I switch to 15, that's going to boost the low end a little bit. I've got plenty of low end, so I'm just going to stick with the 30 inches per second. Then the tape type, just a subtle difference. I'm not even driving this very hard. All I'm just trying to do at this stage, just add a little bit extra flavor on the bass guitar sound. Nothing too fancy. Next, I'm going to talk about the compressors that I'm using. First one I've got is the 1176. I'm using the Waves version. Just hoping to take off just a little bit of the signal, compress it a little bit. Hopefully it's obvious to you that the performance of the bass guitar was a little bit too dynamic, in the sense that some notes are louder than others, some notes will cut through more than others, and that's a problem. You want your bass guitar to pretty much sit at an even level throughout your song, and using a compressor is a great way to solve that issue. So the first one I've got here is 1176 with a pretty fast attack and a pretty fast release. So that's just going to do a little bit of leveling, not a whole lot of work, just 1 or 2 dB maximum of gain reduction is all I'm going for here with a ratio of 4. Next we're going into the LA2A. Again, just maybe 2 dB max is all I'm doing, and it's going to do, putting these two together is actually going to be good for, by putting 2 dB back to back in 2 compressors, you're going to do plenty of compression so that the bass is going to be loud and consistent throughout your track. So nothing really fancy what I'm doing. Sometimes what you can do is turn up the high frequency control here. Not all models of an LA2A will have this, but the Waves version does. What it does is it means your compressor isn't going to be influenced by frequencies that are below what you set it at. So I'm setting it around 70 hertz. So any frequencies that are in my bass signal are not going to trigger the compressor to start doing gain reduction. Sometimes that's good, especially for bass or kick drum, if you don't want your compressor to be sensitive to the low frequencies and over compress because of them. So those are the compressors. Next up is my SSL channel that I've got. Let me take you through that. Why don't I set this on loop so we don't have to keep starting it. Alright, so we've got the SSL channel. Let me tell you about what I'm doing. Right off the bat, I am using a high pass filter or a low cut, right around 70 to 75 hertz. And the reason why I'm doing that is I want the bass guitar to stay out of the way of the kick drum. So you have these two instruments that kind of occupy your low frequency range. You got your kick drum and you have your bass guitar. Sometimes what can happen is that they're both around the same frequencies. What it can do is kind of just muddy up the mix, or with the bass guitar, what it can do is cause your kick drum to be less punchy. And that fundamental frequency of your kick drum, depending on your instrument that you're using, can be somewhere between 50 hertz and 70 hertz, somewhere around there, depending on how it's tuned and all that stuff. So what I'm doing is, I'll show you here, is I have 2 frequency analyzers going. One's on my bass guitar track. That's this one right here. Let me bring up this other one that's on my drums. So a frequency analyzer is, what it's going to do is tell you what energy in your signal is at different frequencies. So So you can see right here, this is the bass guitar one where I've got the energy going. What I want to try and do is just make sure that it's not a lot of energy in this region, where over here between 30 and 60, I have more going on with my kick drum. So what I've done by using the high pass filter is pull out some of the problem areas that will overlap the kick drum over here. I've got this set on the resolution down here as 10 Hertz, so I can see a better idea. If you have it at 40 Hertz, sometimes it's difficult to see exactly what's going on. So I've got it at 10 Hertz. I can see above 62 or so is where I have more of my energy in the bass, and below then there is fine. Alright, so let me play these with the drums. Now the whole mix, hopefully you can hear I have plenty of low end still in my bass guitar, even though I'm using the high pass filter. And hopefully that will help my kick drum be nice and punchy. Here's the mix. Okay, so that was the signal chain that I'm using. I've got them on both these tracks, and I just muted or I bypassed the ones on this other track. But it's the same identical thing I've got on both tracks for the recording. The next thing that I want to do is move on to discussing some kind of nonlinear processing that you can have sometimes in plugins. And I'm going to motivate the discussion by showing you in the SSL channel that when you increase the signal level at the output of the plugin, that waves built into the plugin, this kind of nonlinear processing to emulate the kind of saturation that goes on when you have an analog desk or an analog mixer, like an SSL console. So similar to like the VCC, that there's some nonlinear processing that goes on, the SSL channel strip from Waves has kind of like an output limiter. And what that's going to do, you can overdrive the plugin so you can get some extra kind of harmonics going on in your signal. This can be used for any kind of instruments, drums, bass, electric guitar, vocals, and stuff like that. But I'm going to show it you here with bass first. And it's just a little extra special effect that you can do. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's noticeable, sometimes it's very subtle. But I'm going to show it you here with bass. To demonstrate exactly what's going on, or to give you a better idea, what I'm going to do is show you what I've got set up over here. This is I've got a signal generator. And what I'm going to show you, this is just a sine wave. What I'm going to show you is how these plugins will add some kind of harmonics or saturation to this signal by showing you this signal that's a sine wave. So let me bypass this one. I'm going to bring up some spectrum analyzers. So before I was showing you the waves one, and this other one here is one from IK Multimedia. You can see with my signal generator, I muted it right now because it would be really annoying for you to listen to. I have 1000 Hertz tone, is going into my spectrum analyzer, and I see 1,000 hertz right here. Similarly, on my waves one, I've got 1,000 hertz right here. Next, let me show you what happens if I open up the SSL channel. Right now, I've got the output set at unity gain. All this stuff is pretty much set at unity, how the plugin is initialized. What I'm going to do is drive the output. You're going to see here that it's going to start saturating. And it'll go into the red. Cool. Now the problem is I'm also saturating my channel. What you can do is add in this trim plugin, bypass it, and bring it back to a reasonable level. The reason why you can do this without actually clipping your signal, digitally clipping your signal, is that inside of Pro Tools or any DAW really, I know for Pro Tools for certain, you actually have more internal headroom of processing than what you would have for your output from your digital to analog converter. So your output DAC from your computer that goes through your, like I have mine going through my Digi002, has a digital to analog converter. You have to be careful not to have your signal that goes out of your computer and into your digital to analog converter be above a certain level, because what that's going to do is clip your the converter. However, inside of Pro Tools, there's actually a higher amount of headroom that you can use for processing between plugins. So the signal that I have coming out of my SSL channel is really loud. And however, then I can just insert a trim plugin after it and back the gain back down to a reasonable level that I can use for the output. I'm just showing you this with a sine wave. What happens is, now when I bring up the spectrum analyzer, you're going to see an extra harmonic over here. We have my 1000 hertz tone, but all of a sudden I have an extra harmonic. This is true over here too. You're going to see an extra harmonic over here. What's going on? I just have a single tone going through my SSL channel, and at the output I have multiple harmonics that start showing up at different levels. What's happening is the SSL channel has some kind of internal limiter that affects the output signal of the plugin. So if the signal goes too high, the plugin is going to do some kind of compression on it or limiting on it. This is going to simulate what's going on inside of an analog console. The harder you drive it, it's not going to have an infinite range that you can continue to turn it up. And in fact, like analog consoles like that have a range where it behaves more linear, in the sense that you put one frequency in, you get one frequency out. However, when you start getting into like nonlinear areas or levels when a console's operating, then you have the opportunity that you put one frequency in, you get that frequency and maybe a different one out. And that's kind of the idea with nonlinear processors. So that's one thing that can be true about a nonlinear processor. You put in one frequency, you don't just get that frequency out, maybe you get a different one. Hence, it's nonlinear. So that's one thing that can be meant by nonlinear. So let me show you again what's going on. I drive it here, I trim it back, and what I get here at the output is two harmonics. Let me show you what can happen. I just back this back down to where you're not saturating the plugin. Move the trim back up, and you'll see that harmonic is gone now. That harmonic appears when I drive the plugin. So I back it back down to that same level with the trim plugin, and I start to see that harmonic show up again. Now, Not all plugins have this kind of functionality. It has to be built in, so Wave's built in this kind of console emulation or saturation into their plugin. This is the SSL channel. The SSL G channel, which is the other one in the bundle, that's a full channel strip, has that same thing. However, let me make this one inactive, make this one active. And what I'm doing here is driving this one. And then I'm trimming it, you'll see here. However, the SSL EQ, which doesn't have the compressor, the gate, or anything like that, this one is still linear in the sense that even though I go above what would be considered clipping in the plugin, I still have that headroom of an extra signal level inside of the internal processing of the DAW, that if I just put a trim plugin on the output to reverse the effects of boosting the signal right here, what you have is just the single harmonics there at 1000 hertz. So that's one cool thing about the SSL channel that's not in the SSL EQ. So let me go ahead and bypass or make this one inactive. Another plugin that I know that this is the case, that it's true about, is the V series plugins. So I have the VEQ3 here, and I'm clipping it, I'm driving it hard, about 15 dB here, backing off with the trim. Now let's look at the spectrum analyzer. You see more harmonics showing up here. Yep, see more ones here. So what's going on? This one has just a different kind of saturation that it adds to the signal compared to the SSL channel strip. So what you can do is, if you want to add in this kind of extra saturation, is to consider using the V series or the SSL channel. Let me go back to the bass guitar and play around with this so you can hear the effects. All right, so what I'm going to do, that's what the bass guitar sounded like before. I'm going to drag this trim over here and turn up the SSL channel, drive the output. So this is a subtle thing that's going on. It's not too dramatic, so I back it off. Drive it again. So you can hear that I was saturating my digital to analog converter. All right, what I'll do is go ahead and back this one off. I'll just add the VEQ and drive it without doing any EQ on it, so you can hear maybe how that one sounds a little bit different. So what I've shown you now is a little bit about things that you should know about inside of a DAW is like the headroom and the gain staging between plugins. So you can actually drive the input of a plugin above what you would consider, maybe what the signal will be that's going to hit your DAC. If you drive it higher, then if your plugin has some kind of special processing, most of them actually don't, but the SSL channel does, the VEQ does, and I'm sure, some of these other ones that are specifically kind of nonlinear processing, the VCC, maybe the virtual tape machines also, they might have some kind of thing as well. But, like I showed you with the SSL EQ, it doesn't have that kind of functionality. But, it's something to play around with your plugins. In this case, with the bass guitar, it wasn't doing a whole lot. Maybe it was just making things a little bit maybe a little bit more compressed or limited, and that's a lot of what's going to happen. Is the dynamic range is going to get compressed a little bit. You're going to add maybe a few harmonics, but it's really the dynamic range that's going to see the most influence by doing this kind of processing. Anyway, hopefully you guys picked up some ideas about mixing bass guitar, and also then about what goes on inside of a DAW with gain staging with plugins. I'm going to play out the song here so you can hear it again with the bass guitar. I'll have another video where I talk about some non-conventional ways to mix the bass guitar. Whereas in this one, I kind of took a approach that's very typical, just some compressors, some equalization, and stuff like that. Until next time, take care, guys.